okay. Todd and I are joining you to talk about underwriting modernization, moving from insight to action. My name is Rick Lanter, Senior Vice President, Product Strategy and Development at CSAA. For those of you who don't know CSAA, we are a personal lines insurance carrier in the U.S. market, focused on home and auto insurance. And one of the reasons why we want to talk about underwriting modernization, the 2022 to 2023 years were very hard. Would you agree, Todd?
Very challenging.
Very challenging, right? A very hard market cycle, probably the hardest market cycle that any of us in the U.S. market have ever experienced. And it exposed us. It exposed us to the fact that we could not move fast enough. We had all these great insights. We had all these great things that we wanted to do as an organization, and we were hampered by slow technology. We were hampered by slow process. And so at about the end of, probably middle of 2023 into 2024, we kicked off an initiative called Underwriting Modernization, which was really about modernizing our whole entire company around being able to move from insight to action. The advent of AI is only going to make that more exacerbated, right? Our need to move from getting amazing insights and putting those insights into market is going to be paramount to our future success and how we compete in the U.S. market. Todd's going to talk a little bit about some current risks that we face, some emerging risks. There will always be challenges, right? If there weren't always challenges, we wouldn't have jobs. There are always challenges. And so Todd's going to talk about some challenges that we're seeing today. And I'm going to come back at the end and talk a little bit more about modernizing our organization.
Thanks, Rick. And before we go into that, I just want to cover quickly the U.S. regulatory market for those of you who aren't familiar. As Rick mentioned, we operate in 23 states, which means we have 23 different regulatory bodies. If you work at a company that writes in all 50 states, you deal with 51 regulatory bodies because DC also has its own. And there is a large spectrum of how easy each one of these states are to work with. On the far right, you can have very difficult states. I'm going to bring up California. California doesn't let us use telematics. California doesn't let us use credit score, and so it's very difficult. And not only that, they ask lots of questions, and it takes a long time. So when Brett mentioned that some of you are only doing rate changes every, quarterly, quarterly is what I'm aspiring to. In fact, in some of these states, I'm aspiring to annually. And so it's a really different market. On the other side of the spectrum, you have states like Wyoming, which is like the yeehaw bang bang side of America, where they basically have no file. You can implement rates immediately as long as it's legal. And so we're working on that spectrum. And the reason why that's important and why we'd be able to need to move fast is some of you may have heard that our president is really fond of tariffs. And I have been asked multiple times by multiple people, like within our board, about how is it going to impact. And I thought it'd be just kind of a good business example to walk you all through on how we're thinking about how tariffs will impact our company. It'll probably be something similar to any US-based insurer. So our claims department is able to understand the country of origin of where all of our auto parts come from. And so as you can see, the majority of our replacement parts come from USAA, but there are already tariffs on USA. And some of that is from steel and aluminum. The next three countries, Japan, Europe, Mexico, makes sense, and including Canada, is the next bulk of where most of our auto parts come from. I do want to point down to China, because every time we hear China has raised tariffs, and like my CEO hears that's 145% tariff on China, they immediately think that means rates are going to need to go up 145%. But the truth is, we get very few of our auto parts from China. And so, big percentages of little numbers are little numbers. And you take where do we get the parts from, and you compare it to where the tariffs come from, and you just multiply those across, and that's kind of how you can get an estimate. And this is how we came up with 15% is roughly what we think loss costs from auto parts specifically come from. I also want to point out is we really have to have an as-of date for what the tariffs are, because at one point I had to put AM and PM. They were changing so much. But again, this doesn't mean rates will need to be 15%, because auto parts is only part of the impact. And so I heard you guys like math before lunch, So that's where we're going to go. And taking a look at auto insurance specifically, because that is the area most impacted by tariffs, we're going to break it down to find out what the overall impact is. I'm going to actually take this node by node to kind of explain it. So in general, like 70% of our loss costs, come from claims, basically money going back to the customer in the form of claims payments. 30% are expenses. We're considering expenses not to be dramatically impacted by tariffs. However, loss costs directly impacted by tariffs. Break that down more. Actuaries look at things as severity and frequency. Frequency is the number of accidents. Severity is the cost of those accidents. And tariffs are not going to cause the number of accidents to increase. However, it will increase the severity of the accidents. But again, we can break that down even further because what we pay out for loss costs or claims, we're either fixing people, medical claims, or fixing cars. And fixing people is roughly, is not going to be dramatically impacted by tariffs, while the auto parts and fixing cars will be. And just so you guys understand, the 25 plus 45% should add up to the previous node, so this is the percent of total costs. So fixing cars is 45% of the costs of what we have for the entire premium that we charge. So when we're looking at fixing cars, you can break that down even further. You can look at replacements, total loss, we have to replace the car, or are we doing a repair? That's where the auto parts come in. And we estimated a 10% impact, and when I say we, there was an economist, Arthur Laffer, that came up with a 10% number, and I just borrowed it. So if we have to, the estimate is that replacing a car will be 10% higher. But when we go back to repairing a car, we talked about the parts earlier, but repairs is still majority being labor, and labor is not dramatically impacted. And so when you take a look at 16% of total cost is the labor to fix a car, 11% of the costs are the auto parts actually increasing because of tariffs. And you do the math of 18% of replacements times 10%, 11% of parts times 15%, we estimate roughly a 3.4% impact to costs. So if tariffs are implemented and sustained, we believe there will be a 3.4% headwind. Now, I do need to emphasize this is only theory because there's two ways this could go in different directions. One, political pressures could have companies swallowing some of these costs, and maybe it won't be that big. A more realistic situation is that people will use tariffs to just raise rates anyway, or raise costs anyways, and so that number could be higher. But the important thing is, regardless of what that number is, we're going to be able to move swiftly, and if tariff number changes, we're going to have to move quickly to make sure we're charging the right rate for the risk. And with that, I'll pass it to Rick to talk more about why we need to move swiftly.
Yeah, thanks, Todd. Let me start with telling a little bit of a story. So about a year ago, I was meeting with one of our business partners in Southern California, and we decided to go to lunch. And he said, I'll drive. It's like, I think he wanted to show off his vehicle. So we went out to the parking lot, and we walked up to the electric truck. I won't say the brand, but it starts with an R and rhymes with a Ivian, in case you were wondering. And it is aesthetically very, very appealing. You walk up, it's got a great design. I was sitting in the back seat. I'm not the tallest person in the world, so I usually default to sitting in the back seat. And the design of the interior matched the design of the exterior. Highly appealing, advanced technology, beautiful screen, amazing aesthetic. And then we start driving, and the drive matched the aesthetic. It was very smooth as we were going along the roads of Southern California. He then said, would you like to ride on the freeway? And we said, absolutely. I want to feel the power of this vehicle. So we pull on the freeway, and he accelerates, and it felt like 0 to 60 in like 1 second. I mean, it was amazing. And I tell you this story because as I think about where we want to move from a technology and a process perspective, the way that I felt in that Rivian is the way that we want our stakeholders to feel, whether they are internal stakeholders or whether they are external stakeholders. We want to have an aesthetically appealing, process. We want to move fast, and we want to accelerate our business forward. I actually asked ChatGPT to describe the Rivian experience, and I'll get to that in a few minutes. But when I think about the hard market cycle that I mentioned earlier, it felt like we were driving a basic sedan. You know, we had none of the cool screens. The acceleration was 0 to 60 in 5 seconds versus 1 second, a basic sedan. And we had 45 different underwriting insights that we wanted to activate. And Robin mentioned earlier 6 months of activation time. That's about right? Every day that we have an insight that we can't convert to action is a day that we lose money. It's a day that we lose a customer. It's a day that we price the risk incorrectly. And so we need to move fast. And so that's what led to underwriting modernization. Moving from a basic sedan to an electric SUV, or maybe an electric truck, maybe a Tesla, maybe a Rivian. But we have to be faster. We have to have a better experience. So I told you I asked ChatGPT to describe the Rivian experience, and here's kind of what it told me. 3 very succinct bullet points. Premium design and technology, right? Premium design and technology. I think the emphasis on that is the word premium. Technology that will help you win. Technology that will help you convert insight into action. Adventure-focused luxury. I don't know exactly what that means, but it sounds like fun. So adventure-focused luxury. But here's what it says. Unique features like the gear tunnel, camp kitchen, and adaptive air suspension. Sounds amazing, right? Comfortable, upscale quality, right? The other one was a curated ownership experience. Personalized Rivian guide support, exclusive adventure charging, and community brand ethos. All of those things are things that we want our stakeholders to feel as they engage with our technology, and all of those are things that we need to have if we are going to win in the marketplace. Premium design, premium technology, luxury experience, curated ownership and purchase experience. The way that our customers engage with us matters at the end of the day. And then lastly, I'll leave you with 3 sort of points as we kind of close out. It's important that we price with precision and deploy at speed, right? Todd mentioned the fact that we work with 23 different regulatory bodies. We would love to be able to change rates daily. Unfortunately, we cannot do that. But we need to provide Todd and team with technology that allows them to make smaller changes faster, right? How do we make smaller changes faster? How do we move from annual cycles to quarterly cycles and maybe even monthly cycles where it actually makes sense? Think local, digitize, and scale global. We're thinking locally in the 23 markets, but we need processes that back up scaling those insights in a global manner. And lastly, navigate volatility with agility. Regardless of the technology that we actually have, we have to be able to back that technology with mindset and process that enable us to move with speed and enable us to navigate market trends. Anything you'd like to add?
No, I mean, it's a great example since there's a little bit of time, like the pricing with precision, deploy with speed. The Rivian example is like a classic example of being able to adjust to the market. For those of you in the US may know of the famous example of a Rivian being rear-ended, little fender bender, cost $42,000 to repair. 20 years ago, the repair shop would just take a hammer and pound it back in, and it'd be under the deductible. And so as cars become more and more sophisticated, we need to react quicker, and so we can make sure we're charging the right rates.
With that will conclude our presentation. Thank you.
Thank you.